Hello, this is the 18th video lesson for Thursday, May 21st. This lesson I'm going to learn about the South and its people. Last lesson you learned about the North and its people. We're talking about the South of the United States, the North of the United States prior to the Civil War. Last lesson you learned that in the North you had an industrialized society. And in this industrialized society means they had factories. A lot of people worked in factories. You had a lot of new technologies being developed in the North. We also learned that the North had a more varied population. They were more diverse. And what's meant by that is not everyone was the same. You had people from many different countries. You had immigrants. You had large numbers, in fact, of immigrants from Ireland and Germany. And you had bigger cities. In this lesson, I'm going to focus in on the South and its people, and we're going to see that there's some major differences. First of all, the South, prior to the Civil War, was sometimes nicknamed the Cotton Kingdom. And the reason why it was called this is because cotton was absolutely vital to the economy of the South. So vital meaning important. And when we say the economy, we're talking about how people or how a society makes and trades things of value. So cotton was extremely valuable. It was the material used to make clothing, and because of all the new technologies which pretty much came out of the North, cotton now could be mass produced into clothing. So what was happening was cotton was being made into clothing faster than it could be picked and faster than it could be processed. So this caused the demand to go way up and made it more valuable. As a result, more and more southern farmers and plantation owners tried to grow cotton. And if you could grow more cotton than anyone else, you could make more money than anybody else. So in the South, there was a lot of incentive to grow cotton. Another thing that made cotton so big in the South was the invention of the cotton gin. And I think I mentioned this before, but the cotton gin was a machine that took the prickly seeds out of the cotton very fast. It used to be that someone had to do this by hand, usually a slave, and it could take all day for a guy to just clean, a couple boxes of cotton. The cotton gin enabled one person with a machine to clean many, many boxes of cotton in just hours. So what happened was this led to a demand for more cotton to be picked. And of course, we know that slaves picked the cotton. That meant you needed way more slaves in the fields picking the cotton. This caused the demand for slaves to go up, and it caused the value of slaves to go up. So not only was there an incentive to grow cotton, there was also an incentive to have slaves. You can see where this is going. I really want to explain this because in our society today, and especially today, it's very hard for modern day Americans to understand why would so many Americans living in a region want to have slavery? Why would they think it's okay? Why would they fight to keep it? And hopefully this makes it a little easier to understand. I'm not saying it makes it right. I'm just saying hopefully it makes it easier to understand. Plantation owners, we have to remember, were the ones who owned most of the slaves. They were the richest people in the South, and they also were leaders in the Southern government. They did not want to see slavery abolished under any circumstances because this would totally change the economy of the South. In other words, the system of making and trading things of value. And in the South, the biggest thing of value was cotton. And probably the second biggest thing of value were slaves themselves. So because of that, Southern leaders didn't want slavery abolished. If they did, they would probably lose their wealth plus their ability to make future wealth by growing cotton. In addition to this, there's something else. There were barriers to industry. There was really no incentive for Southerners to do what was going on in the North. In other words, build factories and manufacture goods. So there were four barriers to industry, to creating factories in the South. The number one barrier was cotton itself, which I just explained. Another barrier was the lack of capital. Capital means money for investment. Most money was tied up in land and slaves, so you didn't have any money laying around ready to go spend to build factories, which were expensive. The third barrier was there was not a huge demand for manufactured goods in the South. You had a smaller population in the North, smaller cities, and you had many self-sufficient farmers who made their own goods. They didn't have to buy them. Also, a large percentage of the people in the South were slaves themselves. Slaves didn't earn money, and slaves weren't allowed to leave the plantation to go to the store, so they couldn't buy anything anyway. And then finally, the last barrier was the lack of canals, huge lack of railroads, and the fact that most roads in the South were poor. So in other words, in order to have industry and make goods, you have to have a way to get those goods from the factory to people and to markets. If your roads and transportation systems are terrible, it becomes very expensive to transport goods. And that's exactly what was the problem in the South. It would have been very expensive to deliver the goods because the roads, the canals, the transportation systems were very poor. Last thing I'll talk about is the South's people. A lot of people think in the South you had lots and lots of rich plantation owners and lots of slaves. And that's not entirely true. The majority of people in the South were small farmers. And most of those small farmers did not own slaves. They simply couldn't afford them. There were three types of small farmers. The ones who were best off were called the yeomen. These were small farmers who owned their own land. Some yeomen may own a slave or two, maybe even up to 10. But most yeomen did not have slaves. They were family-owned farms. And of course, the benefit here was they owned their own land, so they were better off. They had more wealth because they owned their land. The second group of small farmers were tenant farmers. These were farmers that rented the land or worked on plantations. This would be considered the lower class. And then there's a group of people below them, the rural poor. The rural poor lived on the worst land, the cheapest land, which was often on the front in the woods, in the hills. They grew mostly corn and beans, and they relied a lot on fishing and hunting. And they may have had a couple animals, like a pig or a cow, some chickens, and that was about it. This was the poor class of the South, and there were lots and lots of rural poor. So those were the small farmers, and that's most of the population. A smaller percent of the population were plantation owners. These were the richest people in the South, and they were considered the upper class. Plantation was a huge estate up to several thousand acres. And just to give you an idea how much an acre is, most properties in Rotterdam are a quarter of an acre. That means your front yard, your backyard, and the land your house is on. That's 1/4 of an acre. So to get 1 acre, you got to take your house and property, take a look at your neighbor to the right, your neighbor to the left, and then add your neighbor across the street, all to your property, and that would all be 1 acre. A plantation could be 1,000 acres. They were huge. And on that land, they grew lots and lots of cotton or other cash crops. But by this time, cotton was what was mostly grown. Many slaves worked on plantations. Most picked the cotton. But they also worked other jobs, such as repairing things, working in the plantation house, working as carpenters, working as blacksmiths. There was one man who sometimes had helpers to help him with his job, and that man was called the overseer. The overseer was the man who made sure that the slaves did their work and also didn't escape. Now, a huge percentage of the population in the South were slaves themselves. I don't have that figure right in front of me. There is a pie chart in the book. I think it's like 40% of the people were slaves. But I could be wrong on that. But slave life obviously was bad. You've learned this already in other grade levels, that life as a slave was terrible. Slaves were not treated well. They were not treated humanely. So I'm not going to get into all the inhumane treatments, but I'm just going to touch on a couple things. For example, slave family life. Slaves had families just like we belong to families, but the one thing they had to live with that we don't was the constant fear of their family being broken up. And that's a tough thing to live with, especially as a parent, knowing your kids could be taken away from you, but also as a kid, knowing you could lose your parents at any moment. And what they were scared of was being sold. It wasn't uncommon for big families, especially, to be broken up by having some members of the family sold to another plantation for money. Another thing slaves had to live with were the slave codes. These were laws in the South designed to control slaves. Slave codes did things to make slaves, to make it harder for slaves to escape, and also to make them fearful to not escape. For example, slave codes said slaves could not learn to read or write. It said they couldn't leave the plantation. It said they couldn't meet in groups. This was all designed to make escaping very hard. They also permitted any kind of punishment possible for a slave. So slaves could be punished, very inhumanely, very cruelly. And of course, this was done to scare other slaves into escaping. Now, slaves did resist. You're probably saying, why didn't the slaves fight back? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? Well, the reality is they did fight back. They fought back in different ways. As far as outright warfare or rebellion, this was rare, but there were slave rebellions. The most famous one was the Nat Turner Rebellion. 55 whites were killed in this rebellion, and this happened in Virginia. But Nat Turner, who was a slave who led the rebellion, he was captured and he was eventually executed. And after this, the slave codes got even worse. There were other rebellions besides Nat Turner's, but they were rare. And they were rare because they never worked. The slaves never won. And things would often be worse for them. So over time, slaves figured other ways to resist. Most slaves resisted by working slow, faking being sick, or sometimes even breaking tools so they couldn't do their jobs. But the ultimate form of resistance was escape. As time passed, more and more slaves attempted escape because they figure, what do they have to lose? Slaves actually, believe it or not, were rarely executed for escaping because, remember, slaves had value. If a slave was caught escaping, which many were, they would usually just be returned to the master, or their owner, I should say, but they would be punished severely. They could be whipped severely, beaten severely, or possibly even mutilated. What I mean by that is, they might have a toe cut off or an ear cut off. And again, this was designed to terrify the other slaves and prevent them from escaping. Eventually, escape became pretty elaborate, and a thing called the Underground Railroad was created, and we'll learn more about that next chapter. So that's it for this video lesson. This was 2 sections of the book. I talked a little longer than usual here. We're going on 13 minutes right now. But for tonight, or today, or whenever you do this, make sure that you complete the questions for chapter 13, sections 3 and 4. And there will be a couple of video links related to life in the South. I highly suggest you watch them. So with that said, I'll wrap this up. Have a happy Memorial Day weekend. Remember, Memorial Day is on Monday. That's a holiday, national holiday, in which we honor the men and women who died serving in the military. So just keep that in mind on Monday. And there is no online learning for any subjects on Monday. So have a good weekend and get your stuff done by next Tuesday, and stay connected and stay well. Thanks, and see you later.